I'm David May. Thanks for tuning into this edition of CID Property Management's online training session. Today, we're going to be talking about reserve studies. And the reserve studies are important for every single community, every single property owner within each community. And so it's an important area to know a little bit about. And we're going to touch on those areas today. We're going to look at California Civil Code. We're going to look at the individual reserve studies themselves, some details about each of those. And hopefully you'll come away with this with a little bit better understanding and information in regards to what it means to get a reserve study done and how that's going to affect you as a homeowner within your community. So in preparing for this today, I talked to and consulted with a couple of reserve specialists, reserve companies that do reserve studies. We've worked with both of these individuals before. And so the first one is McCaffrey Reserve Consulting. And you can go to their website at mccaffreyreserveconsulting.com and you can get a little bit more information about their specific company. And you can also go to Strategic Reserves. We talked to them as well and got some good input from both of those companies. From Strategic Reserves, you can go online and check their website out at src-reservestudy.com. So with that in mind, let's take a look at reserve studies. First of all, what are reserves? I mean, you need to have a starting point, so let's start with the first thing is reserves. What are they? Well, they provide the funding necessary for the repair, restoration, replacement, or maintenance of the portions of the property that the association is obligated to maintain. So that's your basic definition of what reserves are. It's money that's set aside, kind of your savings account, if you will. What is a reserve study? Well, that is a detailed report that assists HOAs in planning for long-term common area repair and replacement expenses. It identifies the funds that have to be set aside on a regular basis to meet the replacement costs of the association's major capital expenses. And reserve studies are needed because of shared ownership or right of use to common areas. So with that in mind, with those definitions in mind, you need to also take a look at some of the applicable California law. Now, it goes into a lot more detail. If you go into the California Civil Code, you'll see a lot more there. It's also governed, you're all governed by what's in your governing documents, your CC&Rs typically. And so those will also have some information regarding reserves. But the overriding one is California Civil Code. And so let's take a look at a couple of those areas that are important to know about. First of all, California Civil Code 1365 addresses the annual reserve disclosures to members. And within that, they give a breakdown here of the different areas that they want to have disclosed to each of the property owners. And first of all, you have the current estimated useful life, estimated cost and useful life and remaining life. And we'll see examples of all these as we go along, but these are what California Civil Code talks about. Current estimate of the amount of cash reserves necessary, current amount of accumulated cash reserves set aside, the percentage that the amount of cash reserves accumulated equals the amount of cash reserves estimated. And continuing on, we see that a statement as to whether the Board of Directors has determined or anticipates one or more special assessments is required. The mechanism or mechanisms by which the Board of Directors will fund reserves, including assessments, borrowing, use of other assets, deferral of selected components, or alternative mechanisms. And then a general statement addressing the procedures used for calculation and establishment of those reserves. Again, these are all items that will be within that disclosure statement that we'll be looking at a little bit later. But I just want to let you know what the California Civil Code talks about. And also 1365.2.5 addresses that as well, the annual reserve disclosures to members. Disclosures required shall be summarized on the Assessment and Reserve Funding Disclosure Summary form. And this form shall accompany each pro forma operating budget. So these are a couple more areas that talk about the California law regarding reserve studies. So finally, we have 1365.5, which talks about a visual inspection of the major components. That needs to be done at least once every 3 years. The Board of Directors shall cause to be conducted a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of the accessible areas of the major components. And that's where your reserve specialists come in and they put together this reserve study that is so important to you. Now, the bottom line here is that a full study must be performed at least every 3 years, and updates must be done annually in the intervening years. The information from the reserve study must be included in an annual budget that is sent to the owners, including the disclosure summary. And then starting in 2009, associations must adopt a reserve funding plan. So the different types of studies that we alluded to here or talked about, the full study, well, that includes an on-site inspection and a financial analysis. And then an update would be no on-site inspection, only financial analysis. And those are typically going to be at a reduced cost to you. And so you don't have to put out the whole amount each year for a full reserve study. Now, these reserve studies are to be used in a number of different ways, primarily as a budget planning tool. Now, the reserve study is a budget planning tool which identifies the current status of the reserve fund, and it establishes a stable and equitable funding plan to offset the expected future common area expenditures. And so let's take a look at what this whole thing looks like. It's broken down into two major components. It consists of two parts, the first one being the physical analysis, the second is the financial analysis. So let's talk about the physical analysis first. Physical analysis is a component study of the major common area components and forms the foundation of the entire reserve study. And it consists of a component listing or inventory, which is taken of all the physical assets of the association. It'll give the current cost estimate for each component, useful life estimate for each component, the remaining life estimate for each component, and it may include also a field report or condition assessment for some of these different components. So what are these different components that you'll be looking at? Well, you've got, for starters, you've got roofing, and this, by the way, will vary depending on each association. Some associations have more complex inventories of property that the association owns and is responsible for. Condominiums have a much more extensive list as opposed to just single-family homes with little assets in the way. Maybe there's not even a pool or a clubhouse. So, but it'll vary. But some of these may include roofing, exterior painting, asphalts on the streets, pool and clubhouse, fencing and entry gates, landscaping, common mechanical equipment, all kinds of things that the association is responsible for would be included within this reserve study. And so that's what the common components typically consist of. Some additional considerations would be that the components should also have a predictable life and replacement cost, and that California does require that all components with less than 30 years remaining life are to be included within the reserve study. So if you have something that lasts longer, like a block wall, for example, that's a solid object, it's not going to go anywhere, it's not going to break down typically, that would not be included in the reserve study. Sidewalks typically would not be included there because they have a longer life than 30 years. You may do some repairs on these items, but those will not typically be included. And let's take a look then at the component summary that you see here on the screen. Within that, for example, if you look in that first section, pool area, you'll see there are a number of areas that refer to different sections within the pool area of different items. Pool resurface, tile and coping stones, the heater, filter, pump motor, furniture. All those items are reserve items that are part of your inventory. You can see there in your useful life how many years that is expected to overall be good for. For example, the heater typically has a 10-year useful life. On this particular item here, you can see that there are 3 years remaining. And so you've got 3 years more before you would typically have to get a brand new heater put in to replace that. And so each item is going to be reviewed, looked at, and determined when and how much its useful life is, what the remaining life is, how much it's going to cost typically, and how much you need to be budgeting. So that gives you the budgeting amount that you need to know about for each individual item. Now within that, after you see the component summary, you may see something like this, where you'll have a breakdown of each individual item. Like, for example, in the pool and spa area, you might have the pool equipment breakdown. Here you see a pool register and the spa equipment. So all of these items would be in there. Within the clubhouse, you can see that you'd have a separate line item for the furniture, different bits of information regarding that, and audio equipment, and those sorts of things within the clubhouse would all be part of that. So these are all the different things that you'll have within your community. You'll have this complete inventory list of what you have within the community and what your estimated useful life is. So you'll take a look at that. Now, once you've got this component listing all done, then you'll have the financial analysis that will be done. So let's take a look at the financial aspect or financial analysis of this. The financial analysis is a funding study that utilizes vital information in the physical analysis to determine the reserve allocation, the percent funded, cash flow analysis. So all of these different three things will be part of the financial analysis. So let's take a look at each of those individually, starting with the reserve allocation. The reserve allocation is the amount to be annually budgeted towards reserves based on a funding plan. And the reserve allocation is a significant part of the overall budget and therefore considered a critical element of the funding study. And so where are you going to get that information? Well, the best way to do it and the most easy way to understand it is to take a look at the executive summary. Executive summaries are always great. They're concise. They take a look at compiling all of the various data within the study, and it gives you a good snapshot, a good overview of what's happening within your community. So let's take a look here at this executive summary. Now, this is an association that we've been using as an example, and it's showing that a fully funded reserve balance here, and as you can see in the yellow section, would be $69,850. And right now they're projecting a balance of money that's set aside in their reserves, the cash savings account, if you will, of $54,000. So there's a formula for getting to the percent funded of 77.3, and you can see also within the lower part here how much this is going to mean in terms of individual assessments and so forth within your community. Now, so what does percent funded mean then, that 77.3%? Well, that's a comparison of the fully funded balance to the reserve balance, and that's projected to the year end, the fiscal year end. And it's expressed as a percentage and used to provide a general indication of the reserve strength. So that's what percent funded means. And what it further means is, how do those numbers break down? Well, 70 to 100% would be well funded, 30 to 70% would be fairly funded, and 0 to 30% would be poorly funded. So obviously you don't want to get into that poorly funded amount. You want to get into the well-funded amount, 70 to 100% or better. And so that would be the goal of your association, and that's what you want to look at in terms of that percent funded. And you can calculate that out. They have, as you can see here on the screen, you see an example of a boiler that's estimated at cost of $10,000. And it goes through the different formula and how to determine what the percent funding is. The bottom line here, you can see that they have $5,000 set aside. They need $6,000 to be fully funded, so dividing $6,000 into $5,000, it comes out to 83.3% funded. So that it's not rocket science. It's pretty easy and straightforward, but that's what that means. And that then you just compare that number with the funded percentage, and you're wanting to stay within that 70 to 100% range. The chart you see up here right now is the theoretical 30-year funding plan. We talked about that a little bit earlier, that you need to have a funding plan. So here's what that's going to look like. Now you can see that the fully funded balance in year 2009 showed as $69,850, as we had mentioned earlier. That was on the executive summary that you saw. And you saw that the balance estimated at the end of the year would be $54,000, which gives you a 77% funded balance. Now you can go down that list there, and you can see, if you continue on with that current funding plan, where the association is going to be. And you can also go over to the recommended funding plan that the Reserve Specialist company will put together. And you can see that in year 2009, they started out at the 77%. And then if you stay with their funding contribution recommendation, then it will continue to grow, and ultimately it will be up to the 95% level that you see in 2039. So that's the ideal direction that you want to head. You want to continue to move upward in terms of your funding percentage, and that's the fiscally responsible. You're fulfilling your fiduciary duty by continuing to move in that direction. I know it's difficult, but it is something that needs to be done because it does affect, again, everybody within your community. Let's take a look at the cash flow analysis. Here, a cash flow analysis is a projection or forecast of expected reserve allocations and disbursements over a time frame. And so you want to get a positive net reserve balance at the end of every year, and you want to have enough cushion provided to fund unexpected disbursements resulting from premature component failure and or higher than expected costs, because things always happen, bad things happen to good communities. And so you want to look at those trends in the percent funded parameters. You want to see whether it's strengthening, stationary, weakening, whatever the case may be. And so here you see the reserve, 30 years reserve funding balance projection, and you can see the red would be fully funded, and if you stay with the recommended funding plan, you're going to be pretty close to the fully funded. Current, you can see, is much lower, and you're going to be having a big gap there, and it widens over a period of time. So that's what the trends will look like, and you want to make sure that your trend is staying in the upward direction. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Reserve Disclosure Funding Summary. This is a new form required to be included with the budget every year. It's intended to assist owners and buyers by summarizing the reserve study findings. And of course, you need a current reserve study to fill out correctly. And this is what the funding disclosure summary looks like. This is going to give your homeowners a snapshot of where they're at. And this, if you go back there, think back to what that California law that we talked about earlier addressed, where you have to have these certain items addressed within the disclosure summary. This is it. And so you've got all of these items are addressed within this disclosure summary. This particular one you see on the screen is from McCaffrey Reserve Consulting, And the next one that you see is from Strategic Reserves. Now they both provide the basic same information. It provides they're slightly different layout. Each reserve specialist is going to have their own type of program that they use, that they put together, but they're all going to have the requisite information that you need to have for making your decisions within your community. Now, some expenses that are not included in the reserve study would be items that are annually or monthly used as expenses. In other words, you wouldn't include any of these. Things like insurance, utilities such as water or electrical, maintenance contracts, tree trimming if it's done annually. If it's done less than annually, you won't need to put that in your regular monthly expenses. This will be in your reserves, but if it's done like once every 2 years, you have your trees done. So it really depends on the frequency as to how often your things are done, as to whether it would be included in the reserves or included in your regular operating expenses. Now, there's going to be a timeline that you're going to want to go through to make sure that you get this all done. You'll want to put this onto your annual calendar, your planning calendar for the year. And so let's take a look at the time frames that you should be looking at doing the reserve studies and getting that all rolling. You see here the timeline, for example, if your fiscal year and your calendar year are one and the same, in April you'd want to obtain proposals for the reserve study from your different reserve specialists. In May you would take a look and review and accept the proposal. In June you would want to have them start the reserve study, and in July you would review and approve the rough draft that your reserve specialist will send to you. Then in August, you want to complete the reserve study report. You get that back, and that will be completed. And then in September, you'll get the budgeting process started. And in October, you'll review and approve the budget, which will include the reserve study information, and hopefully you'll be using the recommended amounts for your reserves. And that will all be part of your budgeting process. And then in November, you need to mail all the disclosures out along with the budget to your association. We take care of all of that for you in terms of making sure that the reserves get all put together and done on the time frame. But you need to know what those time frames are, and sometimes you'll have a committee, and they'll be pulling all the reserve specialist reserves information together, the reserve study, and making any changes, that sort of thing. But come November, when we send out the financial disclosures, or rather all the various required disclosures, to include the reserve funding disclosure and the budget and that sort of thing, that's the annual disclosure packet that we send out for you. Now, we've talked about the reserves and the California law and what the reserve study looks like and that sort of thing. So what's the payoff? Is there a payoff here? Absolutely there is. There really is a big payoff, and that is, primary payoff is that the property values are going to be directly affected by the level of maintenance and upkeep of the common area components. And so by helping to maintain property values, by doing the maintenance schedule, that sort of thing, and having the money to do this, you are going to absolutely be maintaining the property values within the association as best you possibly can. Clearly, there are going to be ups and downs within the economy that will directly affect the values, but all things being equal, if you've got an association that is a problem association, you drive in and it looks really bad, versus an association that you drive in and it looks good, the maintenance is all being done, trees are trimmed, clubhouse looks sharp, it's been painted. All those sorts of things will play into whether or not the property values, your property value, will be maintained given the current market situation, whatever it may be, will be high, low, going up or going down. So it is very important to maintain the property values through proper funding of your reserves to be able to take care of the maintenance within each association. What you don't want to do is get special assessments. By doing your reserve study and following the funding plan, you're going to eliminate the need to have special assessments. So you're going to certainly lessen the likelihood of having to do special assessments. You're going to be informing the owners of the association's financial standing, and that's an important aspect. You're going to assure that each member of an HOA contributes their fair share towards the cost of common areas, and the reserve funding also helps establish the HOA dues. And so it's an important thing to make sure that everybody pays their fair share while they're living there. So you don't want to defer and then have new homeowners pay for previous years that the association underfunded the reserves, and so that's going to affect property values, and again, that's the key thing, to maintain, protect, and enhance the value of your community. So the beneficiaries of all this, well, your association members clearly are going to benefit, because proper reserve funding planning protects against declining property values due to financial instabilities that result in special assessments. And then potential buyers understand the reserve study is an important part of the evaluating the property, or the value of the property being sold. They know that if there are good reserves, if everything looks good and is in good shape, that that's going to be a good association to be buying into. And then the lenders know that the reserve study conveys an accurate and complete picture of the association's financial strength and market value. So lenders, if there is underfunded association, for example, California law now requires, or not California law, but FHA guidelines now require that if you are in a condominium association, you have to be 60% funded, or else they will not insure that FHA loan. And so you're going to have to go to conventional loan, and that may limit your pool of potential buyers within your association. Smaller pool of buyers means the fewer people competing to buy, which means that's your property value. Your property values are going to tend to be lower because you have fewer people competing to buy your property, one of the properties within your community. So it does directly affect in so many different ways, in the ways you don't really think about. And that's why it's so important to have good reserve funding. Well, that's a wrap. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video and learn a little bit more about reserve studies. They are important. They're a valuable part of your being a board director or a member of your community, and to know what that means to you. We've gone over a variety of different things today, and hopefully you've got some good information and be able to use that in the future. If you have any questions, always feel free to give us a call. Here's the number on the screen, and we'll be happy to give you a best answer we possibly can, or refer you over to one of our reserve specialists that we work with. So thanks again, and have a great day.